Welcome to lesson 12.6. In today's lesson, we're going to learn how did government policy affect the growth of Western Canada. We'll learn that and more. So stick around and let's learn something. So that immigration policy that the government had as one of its prongs in the national policy, we're going to take a look at how that affected the growth of Western Canada. This is, like I said, lesson 12.6. The national policy means we really wanted to focus on building a strong Canada. We need a strong economy. And by the 1920s, so after World War I, the national policy was in full force. We had our three-pronged approach to building a strong Canada. Our population was increasing because of our immigration. Spelled immigration wrong, I will fix that. Our Canadian Pacific Railway was moving goods from east to west constantly. That is our transportation policy. And business was booming, our economic policy. This table here shows you the percentage of Canada's population here in the West, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. In 1871, 73,288 people lived in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, which accounted for only 2% of the population. But by the 1920s, by 1921, the west of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba saw 22% of Canada's population living here. And it continues to grow even today in modern times. And one of the driving forces of our economy, especially here in Alberta, was that of ranching. And you learned about this in previous years in social studies. But we're going to take a look at ranching specifically here in the province. And it was the Northwest Mounted Police who first discovered that cattle are actually doing very well in southern Alberta because of the grasslands. There was a ton for them to eat. There was a lot of water for them to drink. And when the storms and whatnot came about, they had low hills for shelter. So this is a great place for cattle to thrive. Furthermore, the federal government, so the Canadian government, wanted to prevent American ranchers from coming up and buying land in Western Canada. They really wanted to maintain and create a Canadian identity, and they were worried, again, this comes back to manifest destiny, they're worried about an American takeover. So Canada comes up with a plan, and it leases land to Canadian ranchers for 1 cent per acre per year for 21 years. That is incredibly cheap. That's pretty much free land. And these Canadian ranchers buy up hundreds of acres, hundreds upon hundreds, thousands of acres for super cheap. Okay. In return for this, the ranchers obviously are going to have to develop the West and whatnot, but then Canada also then is going to make sure that the railway is available. And not only that, but this ranching that takes place leads to other businesses as well. So we need to process these cattle and we need to transport the cattle. Okay. Calgary actually itself grows because it starts off as a meat packing center, and it plays a very important role in our economy. Ranching is good for our economy as the profits are very good, which means that ranchers can pay for shipping. Ranchers can then buy equipment. Now, grain and oil obviously are going to be super important in the development of the West, but still, even to this day, ranching is a very important part of our Western economy and provides economic stability to Canada as a whole. That national policy, though, was it entirely fair? Some will argue that it was not fair, and that's what we're going to take a look at right now. The grain farmers felt that the national policy, specifically the third prong of the economic policy in the national policy, actually benefited Eastern Canada more than Western Canada. There were tariffs on foreign goods, but that meant that the farmers had to pay higher prices for equipment. They could have gone south to the United States and bought the equipment for cheaper, which meant more money for them. But because the tariffs were placed on these cheaper American goods, the grain farmers actually had to end up spending more money to buy the equipment that they needed. Now, they were buying Canadian, so that's good. That was what the national policy wanted. But buying Canadian meant paying more for your goods. That also combined with the high cost of shipping grain, that made the grain farmers feel as though Eastern Canada benefited economically better than Western Canada. So, what are the Western farmers to do? Well, they create their own associations to combat these policies. So, we have the Western farmers. They formed the Territorial Grain Growers Association. They later formed the United Farmers of Alberta, and they get together, this association gets together, and they determine what the price of their wheat, what the price of their grain is going to be on the Canadian market. And they did this in response to this economic policy that they felt favored Eastern Canada as opposed to Western Canada. And this gives the Western farmers a much better chance at making a profitable living by selling their goods. All right, I want you to head over to your notebook and complete the questions for this part of the chapter.